The gunshot that shattered the evening calm sent Eleanor Hartwick running toward the barn with her heart lodged somewhere between her ribs and her throat, certain that another tragedy had found its way to the Double R Ranch. She had been folding linens in the main house when the crack of rifle fire split the air, and her first thought was that the rustlers had returned or that one of the hands had been injured with the wild horses they had been breaking all week. Her boots kicked up dust as she ran across the yard, her long skirts gathered in both fists, her auburn hair coming loose from its pins. The September sun hung low over the Montana horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, but Eleanor barely noticed the beauty as fear propelled her forward. The barn door stood half open, and she slowed her approach, suddenly aware that charging headlong into danger was foolish. She pressed herself against the weathered wood and peered inside, her breath coming in short gasps. What she saw made her freeze in confusion rather than fear. Gideon Hale stood in the center of the barn, his rifle still smoking in his hands, pointed at a rattlesnake that now lay in pieces on the straw-covered floor. The big cowboy's shoulders were heaving, and even from her position by the door, Eleanor could see his hands trembling. He set the rifle down carefully against a post and then did something that stole every word from Eleanor's vocabulary. He dropped to his knees right there in the barn, bowed his head, and began to pray. Eleanor had never seen a man pray with such desperate intensity. His voice was low and rough, barely audible, but the barn's acoustics carried his words to where she stood hidden in the shadows. Lord, I thank you for steady aim and quick reflexes. I thank you that no creature you made, poisonous or not, had to suffer. I know that snake was just doing what snakes do, and I am sorry it had to die, but I am grateful that no man or horse will be harmed by it tonight. He paused, and his voice grew even rougher. I am trying, Lord. I am trying to be gentler, to be kinder, to be the man my mama raised me to be before this world hardened me. But my hands remember violence more than they remember kindness, and I do not know if I can ever wash away what they have done. Eleanor felt like an intruder witnessing something sacred and private. She should have backed away, should have returned to the house and pretended she had never heard those broken words. But something rooted her to the spot, something that made her chest ache with an emotion she could not name. She had been working as the housekeeper at the Double R Ranch for 3 months, ever since her father's death had left her destitute and desperate. The ranch owner, Robert Ramsey, was a gruff but fair man who paid decent wages and did not tolerate misbehavior from his hands. He ran cattle across 10,000 acres of Montana grassland, and he employed 15 men to keep the operation running. Eleanor cooked for them, cleaned the main house, and tried to remain invisible. Gideon Hale had arrived at the ranch 2 weeks after Eleanor, and from the start, he had been different from the other cowboys. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of winter sky. His face was weathered and hard, with a scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone, and his hands were calloused and rough. He spoke little, worked tirelessly, and kept himself apart from the other men. The hands whispered about him. They said he had been a gunfighter down in Texas, that he had killed more men than he could count, that he was running from something dark and terrible. They said his quick draw was legendary, that his aim was flawless, that he was dangerous as a coiled snake. They said he had come to Montana to escape his past, to start over, to find redemption. Eleanor had been afraid of him at first. He was so big, so silent, so intimidating. When he came to the house for meals, he sat at the far end of the table and ate without speaking. He never looked at her directly, never smiled, never engaged in the rough banter that the other men enjoyed. His presence seemed to fill whatever room he occupied, and Eleanor found herself holding her breath whenever he was near. But she had also noticed small things about him that did not match his fearsome reputation. She had seen him gently doctor a lame horse, spending hours in patient care when he could have simply shot the animal and been done with it. She had watched him rescue a kitten from a fence post, cradling the tiny creature in his huge hands with such tenderness that her throat had tightened. She had observed him breaking up fights among the hands without throwing a single punch, using only his words and his imposing presence to restore peace. Now, hearing him pray with such raw honesty, such desperate hope for transformation, Eleanor felt something shift in her understanding of Gideon Hale. He was not the cold killer that rumor painted him to be. He was a man haunted by his past, a man fighting against his own nature, a man trying to become better than the circumstances that had forged him. "Help me to be worthy of a different life," Gideon continued, his voice cracking. "Help me to deserve the peace I am seeking. And if I cannot be redeemed, then at least let me do no more harm. Let my hands build instead of destroy. Let my words heal instead of wound. Let me be useful for something good before I meet you face to face." Eleanor's eyes burned with unshed tears. She knew she should leave, but her feet would not obey. She watched as Gideon remained on his knees for several more minutes, his head bowed, his lips moving in silent prayer. When he finally rose, he brushed the straw from his knees and picked up a shovel. He carefully scooped up the remains of the snake and carried it outside to bury it with respect. Eleanor slipped out of the barn before he could return and discover her eavesdropping. She walked slowly back to the house, her mind spinning with what she had witnessed. She had thought she knew loneliness, had thought she understood the weight of trying to remake yourself after tragedy. But Gideon's prayer had revealed a depth of struggle that made her own troubles seem small by comparison. That night, as she served supper to the hungry ranch hands, Eleanor found her gaze drifting to Gideon more often than was proper. He sat in his usual place at the end of the table, methodically eating the beef stew and cornbread she had prepared. His face was impassive, revealing nothing of the emotional turmoil she had witnessed in the barn. But when her eyes met his for just a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something vulnerable and raw before he looked away. "Miss Eleanor, this is the finest stew I have ever tasted," declared Tommy, a young hand with an easy smile. "You surely have a gift for cooking." "Thank you, Tommy," Eleanor replied, glad for the distraction. "There is plenty more if anyone wants seconds." The men cheered and lined up for more, their boisterous energy filling the dining room. Eleanor moved among them, ladling stew and slicing bread, playing her role as the invisible housekeeper. But she was acutely aware of Gideon's presence, of the way he remained seated while the others jostled for position, of how he waited until everyone else had been served before quietly approaching with his bowl. "May I?" he asked, his voice deep and surprisingly gentle. "Of course," Eleanor said, taking his bowl. Their fingers brushed as she handed it back, and she felt a jolt of electricity that made her nearly drop the ladle. Gideon's eyes widened slightly, suggesting he had felt it too, but he simply nodded his thanks and returned to his seat. Eleanor tried to focus on the tasks at hand, but her thoughts kept returning to the barn, to the prayer, to the revelation that this hard man had a tender heart beneath his rough exterior. She had been so lonely since her father's death, so isolated in her grief. She had not allowed herself to feel anything beyond the numbness of survival. But something about Gideon's struggle resonated with her own, and she found herself wanting to know more about the man behind the fearsome reputation. After the meal, as she washed dishes in the kitchen, Eleanor heard boots on the porch. Through the window, she saw Gideon standing alone, looking out at the darkening landscape. He had rolled a cigarette but had not lit it, simply turning it over and over in his fingers. After a moment, he crushed it and tossed it away, as if denying himself even that small comfort. Eleanor dried her hands and, acting on an impulse she did not fully understand, stepped out onto the porch. "The nights are growing colder," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. Gideon turned, surprise evident on his face. "Yes, ma'am, winter will be here before we know it." They stood in awkward silence for a moment. Eleanor searched for words that would not reveal her eavesdropping but might still offer some kind of comfort or connection. "I heard a gunshot earlier," she finally said. I was worried someone had been hurt. Just a rattler in the barn, Gideon replied. No one was harmed. That must have been frightening. Not especially. Rattlesnakes are common enough in these parts. He paused, then added, I am sorry if the noise alarmed you. I am glad it was nothing serious. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself against the evening chill. You seem to handle such things with great calm. Gideon's expression darkened. I have had practice with violence, Miss Eleanor. More than any man should. The bitterness in his voice made Eleanor's heart ache. She wanted to tell him that she had heard his prayer, that she understood he was trying to change, that she saw the gentleness beneath the hard exterior. But she could not find the words, and the moment stretched into uncomfortable silence. I should let you get back to your work, Gideon said finally, moving toward the porch steps. Gideon, Eleanor said, surprising herself with her boldness. He stopped and looked back at her. I believe that a man's past does not have to define his future. I believe people can change if they truly want to. His winter sky eyes studied her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Why would you say such a thing to me? Because everyone deserves a chance at redemption, Eleanor replied softly. And because I think you are trying very hard to be a better man. Gideon stood motionless for a long moment, and Eleanor could not read the expression on his face. Finally, he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. You are kind to think so, Miss Eleanor. I hope you are right. Then he turned and walked into the darkness, leaving Eleanor alone on the porch with her racing heart and her tangled thoughts. Over the following days, Eleanor found herself increasingly aware of Gideon's presence. She watched him work with the horses, his movements careful and patient despite his size and strength. She noticed how he always helped Tommy with the heavy loads, how he checked on the older ranch hands to make sure they were not overexerting themselves, how he spent his evenings mending tack and equipment so that others would have less work to do. She also noticed that he seemed to be watching her. Not in the leering way that some men did, but with a quiet curiosity that mirrored her own. Their eyes would meet across the yard or during meals, and each time Eleanor felt that same electric connection that had sparked when their fingers touched. One afternoon, Eleanor was returning from the creek with a basket of wet laundry when she stumbled on a rut in the path. She pitched forward with a cry, certain she was about to fall face first into the dirt, when strong hands caught her and set her upright. Gideon had appeared out of nowhere, his reflexes as quick as his reputation suggested. Are you hurt? He asked, his hands still steadying her shoulders. No, I am fine, thank you. Eleanor's heart was pounding, and not just from the near fall. Gideon stood so close she could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes, could smell the scent of leather and hay that clung to him. You should be more careful, he said, but his voice was gentle rather than scolding. He released her shoulders and bent to retrieve the laundry that had spilled from her basket. You do not have to do that, Eleanor protested, but Gideon ignored her, carefully folding each item before placing it back in the basket. My mother taught me that a gentleman always helps a lady, he said quietly. She would tan my hide if she saw me standing idle while you struggled. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She was. Pain flickered across Gideon's face. She passed when I was 16. That is when everything went wrong. Eleanor wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to know his story, but she sensed that pushing would only cause him to retreat. Instead, she simply said, I lost my mother when I was 12. It is a wound that never quite heals. Gideon looked up at her, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of shared grief and understanding. No, it does not, he agreed. They walked back to the house together, not speaking but comfortable in the silence. When they reached the porch, Gideon handed her the basket and tipped his hat. Thank you for catching me, Eleanor said. Anytime, Miss Eleanor. Then he smiled, just a small quirk of his lips, but it transformed his entire face. Eleanor caught her breath at how handsome he looked when the hardness melted away, and she felt something dangerous blooming in her chest. That night, Eleanor lay in her small room at the back of the house and admitted to herself what she had been avoiding. She was developing feelings for Gideon Hale. It was foolish and impractical and potentially heartbreaking. She knew almost nothing about him except that he had a violent past and was trying to change. She had no idea if he felt anything for her beyond polite courtesy. And even if he did, what future could they possibly have together? She was a penniless housekeeper, and he was a drifting cowboy trying to outrun his demons. But her heart did not care about practicality. Her heart only knew that when Gideon smiled at her, the world seemed brighter. When his hands had steadied her shoulders, she had felt safer than she had in years. When she remembered his prayer in the barn, she saw a man worth knowing, worth caring for, worth loving. Eleanor pressed her hands to her face and told herself to be sensible. But sense had very little to do with what she was feeling. The next morning, Robert Ramsey announced at breakfast that he needed to make a trip to the town of Benton Creek, about 15 miles from the ranch, to meet with the land office about expanding his grazing rights. He would be gone for 2 days and needed someone to stay at the house to ensure everything ran smoothly in his absence. "Gideon, I want you to stay here," Ramsey said. "You are the best hand I have, and I trust you to handle any trouble that might arise." Gideon nodded. "Yes, sir." Eleanor's pulse quickened at the thought of being alone at the house with Gideon, even though the bunkhouse full of ranch hands was only 100 yards away. It felt intimate and dangerous and thrilling all at once. Ramsey left after breakfast, taking 2 men with him for the journey. The ranch settled into its usual rhythm of work, but Eleanor found herself hyper-aware of Gideon's presence. He spent the morning repairing a section of corral fence, his muscles flexing as he drove posts into the hard ground. Eleanor tried not to stare from the kitchen window, but she found her gaze drawn to him again and again. Around midday, dark clouds rolled in from the west, and the temperature dropped sharply. By early afternoon, rain was falling in heavy sheets, turning the ranch yard into a muddy mess. Eleanor rushed to bring in the laundry before it was soaked, but she was too late. The clothes were drenched, and so was she. She was wringing out sheets on the back porch when Gideon appeared with a heavy oilskin coat draped over his arm. "You will catch your death standing out here in wet clothes," he said, offering her the coat. "I am fine," Eleanor insisted, but she was shivering. "Miss Eleanor, please." Gideon's voice was firm but kind. "Take the coat." She accepted it gratefully and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was far too large and smelled like Gideon, which was oddly comforting. "Come inside," she said. "I will make coffee to warm us both." They went into the kitchen together, leaving puddles on the floor. Eleanor put the coffee pot on the stove while Gideon fed more wood into the fire. The domesticity of the moment struck Eleanor as both strange and wonderful. For just a little while, they could pretend they were simply 2 people seeking shelter from the storm, not a housekeeper and a hired hand with an unbridgeable social distance between them. "You miss Texas?" Eleanor asked as she set 2 cups on the table. Gideon considered the question. "I miss some things, the wildflowers in spring, the sound of cattle on the move, but mostly I am glad to be away from it." "Because of your past," he looked at her sharply. "What do you know about my past?" Eleanor felt her cheeks heat. "Only what the hands whisper, that you were a gunfighter, that you are trying to start over." "The hands talk too much," Gideon said, but without real anger. He wrapped his large hands around the coffee cup and stared into the dark liquid. "But they are not wrong. I was a gunfighter. I killed men for money. I did terrible things that I cannot undo." His honesty stunned Eleanor into silence. She had expected denial or deflection, not this raw confession. "Why did you do it?" she asked softly. "Because after my mother died, I was angry and lost. Because a man named Jack Corrigan found me and taught me how to shoot and convinced me that violence was the only power that mattered in this world. Because I was young and stupid and thought being feared was the same as being strong." He looked up at her, his eyes full of pain. "By the time I realized how wrong I was, I had blood on my hands that I can never wash clean." "But you stopped," Eleanor said. "You walked away." "I walked away after I killed a 16-year-old boy who drew on me in a saloon in Abilene." Gideon's voice was flat and hard. He was trying to make a name for himself by gunning down the great Gideon Hale. He was too young and too slow, and I put a bullet through his heart before I even thought about it. When I stood over his body and saw how young he was, saw his mother's locket around his neck, I knew I could not do it anymore. I knew I had to change or I would end up in hell. Eleanor reached across the table and did something that shocked them both. She placed her hand over his. "You did change," she said firmly. "You are changing. That boy's death was a tragedy, but it woke you up. It made you see what you were becoming. And you have spent every day since trying to be better." "How do you know that?" Gideon asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor hesitated, then decided honesty deserved honesty. "I heard you praying in the barn, the night you killed the rattlesnake. I did not mean to eavesdrop, but I heard you, and I knew then that your heart is gentler than your hands." Gideon stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, he turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. The gesture was achingly tender, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "I do not deserve your good opinion," Gideon said, "but I am grateful for it more than you know." "You deserve a chance at happiness," Eleanor replied. "You deserve peace." They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped across the kitchen table, the rain drumming on the roof above them. Eleanor felt something solidify between them, a connection that went beyond attraction or curiosity. She felt seen and understood in a way she had not experienced since her father's death, and she suspected Gideon felt the same. The moment was broken by a shout from outside. Gideon released her hand and moved to the window, his body tensing. "Riders coming in fast," he said, his voice sharp with concern. Eleanor joined him at the window and saw 3 men on horseback galloping through the rain toward the house. Even from a distance, she could tell something was wrong. Gideon was already moving, grabbing his rifle from where he had left it by the door. "Stay inside," he ordered, then stepped out onto the porch. Eleanor ignored his command and followed him, her heart pounding. The riders pulled up in front of the house, their horses lathered and blowing. She recognized them as neighboring ranchers from the Broken Wheel spread about 5 miles east. "Hale, we need help," the lead rider called out. His name was Ben Carson, and blood was seeping through his shirt sleeve. "We were driving cattle through the canyon when we got ambushed by rustlers. They killed 2 of my men and scattered the herd. There are at least 6 of them, and they are heavily armed." Gideon's face went hard. "Where are they now?" "Holed up in the old line shack at the north end of the canyon. They are waiting for nightfall to move the stolen cattle." Eleanor saw the other ranch hands emerging from the bunkhouse, drawn by the commotion. Tommy ran up to the porch, his young face eager. "We will ride with you, Gideon," he said. "We cannot let rustlers operate in these parts." Gideon shook his head. "This is not your fight. These men are killers." "It is everyone's fight," Carson insisted. "If we do not stop them now, they will pick off every ranch in the territory one by one." Eleanor watched Gideon struggle with the decision. She could see the conflict in his face, the fear that using violence would undo all the progress he had made toward becoming a better man. But she could also see his sense of duty, his understanding that sometimes protecting the innocent required confronting evil. "Please," Carson said, his voice breaking. "They killed Johnny and Sam in cold blood. We need your help to bring them to justice." Gideon looked at Eleanor, and she saw the question in his eyes. She did not know what possessed her to speak, but she found herself saying, "Do what you must do." Protecting people is not the same as hunting them for money. Something shifted in Gideon's expression, a kind of relief mixed with determination. He nodded once, then turned to the assembled men. "Saddle up," he said, "but we do this smart and careful, no unnecessary bloodshed. We try to take them alive if we can." "Agreed," the men agreed, and within minutes they were mounting up. Gideon swung into his saddle with easy grace, checking his rifle and pistol with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done it 1,000 times. He looked down at Eleanor, and for a moment the hardness left his face. "I will come back," he promised. "You better," Eleanor said, surprised by the fierceness in her voice, "because we are not finished talking." Gideon's smile was quick and warm. Then he wheeled his horse around and led the men out into the rain at a gallop. Eleanor stood on the porch and watched until they disappeared from sight, her heart in her throat and her hands clenched so tightly her nails cut into her palms. The hours that followed were the longest of Eleanor's life. She tried to keep busy with chores, but her mind was out in the canyon with Gideon and the others. She had told him that protecting people was different from killing for money, but what if she was wrong? What if this confrontation pulled him back into the violence he was trying to escape? What if he did not come back at all? She prayed as she had not prayed since her father's death, bargaining with God to keep Gideon safe, to bring him home whole in body and spirit. She realized with startling clarity that she had fallen in love with him, this hard man with the gentle heart, this killer trying to become a protector, this lost soul seeking redemption. It was too soon and too foolish and too wonderful, and she did not care about any of that. She only knew that the thought of losing him made her feel like she was drowning. Darkness fell, and still there was no sign of the men. Eleanor lit every lamp in the house and kept the coffee hot, needing to do something, anything, to feel useful. She stood at the window and stared out into the night, watching for the riders that did not come. It was nearly midnight when she finally heard the sound of horses in the yard. She ran to the door and flung it open, her breath catching when she saw Gideon dismounting. He was muddy and exhausted, but he was alive and whole. Behind him, the other men were tying up 6 sullen prisoners whose hands were bound. "Gideon!" Eleanor could not stop herself from running to him. He caught her as she nearly collided with him, his arms coming around her automatically. "I am all right," he said into her hair. "We are all right." "What happened?" We surrounded the line shack and gave them a chance to surrender. 4 of them saw reason. 2 tried to fight their way out. His voice was grim. "I had to shoot one in the leg to stop him." The other surrendered when he saw his friend go down. Eleanor pulled back to look at him. "Did you kill anyone?" "No." The relief in his voice was palpable. "No one died. We are taking them to the marshal in Benton Creek tomorrow." "Thank God," Eleanor whispered. She realized she was still clutching Gideon's coat, that they were standing far too close for propriety, but she could not bring herself to let go. Gideon seemed to realize it at the same moment. He gently disengaged himself, though his hands lingered on her arms for a moment longer than necessary. "I need to help settle the horses and secure the prisoners," he said quietly. "But then I would like to finish our conversation, if you are willing." "I will wait up," Eleanor promised. She returned to the house and put together a meal for the exhausted men, her hands shaking with relief and anticipation. The hands ate quickly and headed to the bunkhouse, leaving 2 men on guard over the prisoners. Carson and his men rode back to the Broken Wheel to deliver the news to the families of the men who had been killed. Finally, the house was quiet except for the sound of Gideon's boots on the porch. Eleanor met him at the door with a plate of food and a fresh cup of coffee. "Sit," she ordered. "You must be starving." Gideon obeyed, lowering himself into a chair with a groan. "I am getting too old for this kind of excitement," he said ruefully. "How old are you?" Eleanor asked, realizing she did not know. 28. "You?" 22. They looked at each other, and suddenly the kitchen felt very small and very intimate. Gideon ate slowly, and Eleanor sat across from him, content to simply watch him and reassure herself that he was truly safe. "I was afraid," Gideon said finally, setting down his fork. "Not of the rustlers, but of myself. I was afraid that once I had a gun in my hand and violence in front of me, I would become that man again. The man who killed without thinking, without feeling." "But you did not," Eleanor said softly. "You did exactly what you said you would do. You protected people without unnecessary bloodshed. You proved that you have changed. Because of what you said." Gideon looked at her intently. "When you told me that protecting people was different from hunting them, it gave me permission to do what needed to be done without losing myself. You gave me that gift, Eleanor." The use of her first name sent a thrill through Eleanor. "I only spoke the truth." "You have been speaking truth to me since the moment we met," Gideon said. He reached across the table and took her hand again, and this time the gesture felt natural and right. You see something in me that I have not been able to see in myself. You make me believe that redemption is possible." "It is possible," Eleanor insisted. "I know it is because I have needed redemption too." Gideon frowned. "What could you possibly need redemption for?" Eleanor looked down at their joined hands. "My father died because of me. He was a merchant in Billings, and we had a good life until I convinced him to invest in a mining venture that a charming stranger proposed. The mine was a fraud, and we lost everything. My father worked himself to death trying to recover our losses, and I blamed myself. I still blame myself." "Eleanor, that was not your fault. You were deceived." "So were you," Eleanor countered. "You said a man named Corrigan found you when you were grieving and vulnerable, and he twisted you into something you were not. How is that different from me being fooled by a con man?" Gideon was quiet for a long moment. "I suppose it is not different at all. We have both been carrying guilt for things that were not entirely our fault. Then perhaps we can help each other learn to forgive ourselves," Eleanor suggested. Gideon stood and pulled Eleanor to her feet, still holding her hand. They stood face to face in the lamplight, and Eleanor could see the battle warring in his eyes. "I have nothing to offer you," he said roughly. "I am a hired hand with a dark past and no prospects. You deserve better than a man like me." "You are wrong," Eleanor said, lifting her free hand to touch his scarred face. "You are exactly the kind of man I want. You are honest and brave and kind. You are trying to be better every single day. You have a gentle heart, Gideon Hale, and that is worth more than all the money in the world." "Eleanor," he breathed, and then he was kissing her, his lips gentle despite the roughness of his hands as they cradled her face. Eleanor melted into him, wrapping her arms around his neck and kissing him back with all the emotion that had been building inside her. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Gideon rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "I did not think I was capable of love anymore, but you have proven me wrong about so many things." "I love you too," Eleanor whispered. "I think I have loved you since I heard you praying in the barn." They stood together in the quiet kitchen, holding each other and marveling at the miracle of finding love in the midst of their broken lives. Outside, the rain had stopped, and through the window, Eleanor could see stars beginning to emerge from behind the clouds. "What do we do now?" she asked. Gideon pulled back to look at her, his eyes serious. "I want to marry you, Eleanor. I want to build a life with you, but I need to do it right. I need to prove to you and to everyone else that I am worthy of you. You do not have to prove anything to me. But I have to prove it to myself," Gideon said firmly. "I have been saving my wages. I have almost enough to put a down payment on a small piece of land. I want to start my own ranch, something that is mine and not built on violence. I want to make an honest living and give you the kind of life you deserve." Eleanor's heart swelled at his determination. "How long will that take?" "6 months, maybe less if I can pick up extra work." "Will you wait for me?" "I will wait as long as it takes," Eleanor promised. They kissed again, sealing their commitment to each other and to the future they would build together. It was not a perfect solution, and Eleanor knew that the road ahead would have challenges. But for the first time since her father's death, she felt hope. She felt like she had found a place to belong and a person to belong with. The next morning, Robert Ramsey returned from Benton Creek to find his ranch in an uproar over the rustler capture. He was full of praise for Gideon and the men who had helped, and he announced a bonus for everyone involved. But he also noticed the way Gideon and Eleanor looked at each other, and he pulled Eleanor aside that afternoon. "I am not a fool, Miss Eleanor," he said bluntly. "I can see that something has developed between you and Hale. I want to know your intentions." Eleanor lifted her chin. "We intend to marry, sir, as soon as Gideon has saved enough to buy land of his own." Ramsey studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Hale is a good man. He has worked harder than anyone I have ever employed, and he has never given me a moment of trouble. If you are certain this is what you want, then you have my blessing." "Thank you, sir. However, I have a proposal." Ramsey leaned back in his chair. "I have been thinking about expanding the ranch, and I need someone I can trust to manage the new section. It is 500 acres about 3 miles north of here, good grazing land with a creek running through it. I would sell it to Hale at a fair price, and he could pay me back over time while managing both his herd and mine. It would give you a head start on your future. Eleanor could hardly believe what she was hearing. Why would you do that for us? Because good men are hard to find, and I do not want to lose Hale. Because you have served my household well and deserve happiness. And because I am getting too old to manage everything myself, and I need someone with Hale's skills and work ethic to help me build this ranch into something that will last. Ramsay smiled slightly. Besides, my late wife would have approved. She always said that love should be encouraged, not hindered. Eleanor threw propriety to the wind and hugged the gruff rancher. Thank you, Mr. Ramsay. Thank you so much. That evening, Eleanor told Gideon about Ramsay's offer. The big cowboy was stunned into silence for several minutes. He would do that for us, he finally asked. He said you have earned his trust and respect. He wants to help us get started. Gideon sat down heavily on the porch steps. I never thought I would have a chance at something like this, a home of my own, a future that is not stained with blood. Eleanor sat beside him and took his hand. You have that chance now, we both do. Over the next weeks, Gideon and Ramsay worked out the details of the land sale. The price was fair and the terms were generous. Gideon would manage both the new section and continue working for Ramsay while building up his own small herd. It would be hard work, but Gideon had never shied away from hard work. In early November, on a crisp autumn day with golden leaves swirling in the wind, Gideon and Eleanor were married in the small church in Benton Creek. The ceremony was simple, attended by Ramsay and the ranch hands who had become their friends. Tommy served as Gideon's best man, and he cried unashamedly during the vows. Eleanor wore a simple blue dress that she had sewn herself, and Gideon wore his best clothes, freshly brushed and pressed. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Gideon kissed Eleanor with such tenderness that several of the rough cowboys had to wipe their eyes. After the ceremony, they rode out to the land that was now theirs. Ramsay had arranged for a small cabin to be built, nothing fancy but solid and weathertight. It sat on a rise overlooking the creek with mountains visible in the distance. It is perfect, Eleanor breathed, taking in the view. It is ours, Gideon said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. A new beginning for both of us. They moved into the cabin that night, and over the following months, they worked together to make it a true home. Eleanor planted a garden and sewed curtains for the windows. Gideon built furniture and a barn for the horses. They acquired chickens and a milk cow, and Ramsay gave them a dozen cattle as a wedding gift to start their herd. Life was not easy. The work was hard and the winters were harsh, but Eleanor had never been happier. She loved waking up beside Gideon, loved seeing his face across the breakfast table, loved working alongside him to build their future. And Gideon, for his part, seemed to grow lighter with each passing day, as if the weight of his past was gradually lifting. He still had nightmares sometimes, waking in the darkness with his heart racing and sweat on his brow. But Eleanor would hold him and whisper words of comfort, and eventually he would relax back into sleep. She never asked about the nightmares, understanding that some demons had to be fought in private. But she made sure he knew that he was not alone in the fight. One evening in early spring, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Gideon took Eleanor's hand. I have something to tell you, he said, his voice serious. Eleanor felt a flutter of worry. What is it? I received a letter from the marshal in Abilene, the one where I killed that boy. Gideon paused, his grip tightening on her hand. He said the boy's mother wanted me to know that she does not blame me for her son's death. She said her boy was wild and headed for trouble, and she is grateful that at least his death made someone else choose a different path. Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. Oh, Gideon. She said she has been praying for me every day since it happened, praying that I would find peace and redemption. Gideon's voice cracked. She forgave me, Eleanor. She actually forgave me. Eleanor pulled him into her arms, holding him as he wept for the boy he had killed, for the forgiveness he had not dared to hope for the grace that had been offered when he did not deserve it. "You are redeemed," she whispered fiercely. "You have paid for your past with every good choice you have made, with every gentle action, with every prayer for forgiveness. You are a good man, Gideon Hale, and I am so proud to be your wife." They held each other as the stars came out, and Eleanor felt Gideon's burden lift a little more. She knew the journey toward complete healing would be long, but she also knew they would walk it together. In May, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. She told Gideon one morning over breakfast, and he dropped his fork in shock. "A baby," he repeated, his eyes wide. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes," Eleanor said, laughing at his expression. In late December or early January, Gideon stood and swept her into his arms, spinning her around the kitchen until she was dizzy and laughing. When he set her down, his face was radiant with joy. "I am going to be a father," he said wonderingly. "I never thought I would have this. A family, a child, a reason to be better." "You have always had a reason to be better," Eleanor corrected, "but now you have another one." Over the months of Eleanor's pregnancy, Gideon became even more attentive and protective. He insisted on doing the heavy chores himself, would not let Eleanor lift anything heavier than a dish, and fussed over her constantly. Eleanor found it both endearing and exasperating. "I am pregnant, not fragile," she protested one day when he tried to prevent her from gathering eggs. "You are carrying my child," Gideon replied firmly. "That makes you precious beyond measure, and I am going to make sure you are both safe and healthy." Eleanor could not argue with that logic, so she let him fuss and tried not to roll her eyes too often. As autumn turned to winter, their herd had grown to 30 head, and the ranch was showing a modest profit. Ramsay was pleased with Gideon's management and had given him more responsibility. Other ranchers in the territory had begun to respect Gideon, not for his gun skills, but for his knowledge of cattle and his fair dealing. The past was slowly being replaced by a present worth celebrating. On a cold January night, with snow falling softly outside, Eleanor went into labor. Gideon rode through the blizzard to fetch the midwife from Benton Creek, his heart in his throat the entire way. When he returned with the capable Mrs. Henderson, he was nearly frantic with worry. The labor was long and difficult, and Gideon paced the front room like a caged animal, flinching every time Eleanor cried out. Tommy had come to stay with him, offering support and trying to distract him with conversation, but Gideon could focus on nothing but the sounds from the bedroom. Finally, just as dawn was breaking, a baby's cry split the air. Gideon nearly collapsed with relief. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, her face tired but smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Hale. A big, healthy boy, and your wife is tired but doing well." Gideon pushed past her into the bedroom, where Eleanor lay exhausted but glowing. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets, and when Gideon looked at his son's face for the first time, he felt his heart break open with love. "He is perfect," he breathed, touching the baby's tiny hand. "You are perfect. We are calling him Samuel," Eleanor said. "After my father, Samuel Joseph Hale." "Samuel," Gideon repeated, and then to Eleanor's surprise, he dropped to his knees beside the bed and began to pray. "Thank you, Lord, for this miracle. Thank you for my wife and my son. Thank you for giving me a life I do not deserve, for grace I cannot repay. I promise I will raise this boy to be good and kind and honorable. I promise I will be the father he needs, the husband Eleanor deserves. I promise I will never stop trying to be worthy of this blessing." Eleanor reached out and stroked Gideon's hair, tears streaming down her face. "You are worthy," she whispered. "You have always been worthy." The years that followed were filled with the joys and challenges of raising a family and building a ranch. Samuel grew into a bright, energetic boy who adored his father and loved helping with the animals. Eleanor gave birth to a daughter 2 years later, a sweet-natured girl they named Rose after Gideon's mother. And 3 years after that, another son arrived, whom they named Henry after Eleanor's father's middle name. The ranch prospered under Gideon's careful management. He expanded the herd gradually, always making sure he could provide proper care for the animals. His reputation for honesty and fair dealing spread throughout the territory, and other ranchers sought his advice. The violent gunfighter was gradually forgotten, replaced by the respected cattleman and devoted family man. Robert Ramsey became a beloved figure in the children's lives, a kind of grandfather who spoiled them shamelessly and told them stories about the early days of the territory. When he passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72, he left the entire Double R Ranch to Gideon and Eleanor in his will, with a letter explaining that they had become the family he never had and that he trusted them to carry on his legacy. Gideon wept when he read the letter, overwhelmed by the trust and affection Ramsey had shown them. Eleanor held him as he grieved for the man who had given them their start, who had seen potential in a broken cowboy and a destitute housekeeper. "He believed in us when we did not believe in ourselves," Gideon said. "I will honor his memory by making this ranch the best in Montana." And he did. Over the years, the combined Hale Ranch became known throughout the territory for its quality cattle and ethical practices. Gideon treated his hired hands fairly, paid good wages, and created a culture of respect and hard work. Many young cowboys who came to the ranch troubled and directionless left as better men, influenced by Gideon's example. Eleanor became a pillar of the community, organizing school fundraisers and church socials. She never forgot what it felt like to be desperate and alone, so she made sure to help those in need. Widows and orphans found employment at the ranch, and travelers knew they could always get a meal and a bed at the Hale place. One autumn evening, when Gideon was 45 and Eleanor was 39, they sat on the porch of their expanded home and watched their grandchildren play in the yard. Samuel had married a schoolteacher from Benton Creek and had given them 2 grandsons. Rose was engaged to a young rancher from the next county, and Henry was attending veterinary school in Bozeman. "Did you ever imagine this?" Eleanor asked, leaning against Gideon's shoulder. "When we met all those years ago, did you imagine we would have all this?" Gideon wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "I did not let myself imagine anything beyond surviving one more day. The idea that I could have a wife I adored, children who made me proud, a ranch that was respected, a community that accepted me, all of that seemed impossible. But it happened anyway. Because of you," Gideon said firmly. "Because you heard me praying in that barn and saw something in me worth saving. Because you loved me when I did not love myself. Because you believed I could change." Eleanor turned to look at him, still seeing the man she had fallen in love with despite the gray in his hair and the lines on his face. "We saved each other," she corrected. "I was just as lost as you were. We found redemption together." Gideon kissed her, a gentle brush of lips that still sent warmth flooding through Eleanor after all these years. "I love you, Eleanor Hale. I have loved you since the moment you told me that my past did not have to define my future. And I have loved you since I heard your prayer and knew your heart was gentler than your hands," Eleanor replied. They sat together as the sun set, watching their grandchildren play and their adult children laugh together, surrounded by the life they had built from broken pieces and desperate prayers. The gunfighter and the destitute housekeeper had become a respected rancher, and his beloved wife, their past transformed by love and grace and the courage to believe in second chances. As darkness fell and stars emerged in the vast Montana sky, Gideon held Eleanor close and whispered another prayer, this one filled with gratitude rather than desperation. He thanked God for the woman in his arms, for the family that surrounded them, for the peace that had replaced the violence of his youth. He thanked God for proving that redemption was real, that people could change, that love could heal even the deepest wounds. Eleanor added her own silent prayer, thanking God for leading her to that barn on that September evening, for giving her the courage to see beyond reputation to the hurting man beneath. She thanked God for every moment of their life together, for the struggles that had made them stronger and the joys that had made it all worthwhile. When their prayers were complete, they rose and went inside together, hand in hand as they had been for 24 years. Behind them, the barn stood silent in the darkness, the place where everything had changed because one woman had heard one man praying and had dared to believe in the power of a gentle heart. The children and grandchildren came inside for dinner, filling the house with noise and laughter. Eleanor moved around the kitchen, serving food and mediating childish disputes, while Gideon sat at the head of the table and watched his family with quiet contentment. This was his redemption, this chaotic, beautiful, perfectly imperfect life. This was what he had been seeking when he fled Texas with blood on his hands and despair in his heart. After dinner, after the grandchildren had been tucked into bed and the adult children had retired to the guest rooms, Eleanor and Gideon prepared for bed in the room they had shared for so many years. The routine was familiar and comforting. Gideon banking the fire while Eleanor braided her hair, the quiet companionship of two people who knew each other so well that words were often unnecessary. As they settled into bed, Gideon pulled Eleanor close, her back against his chest, his arm around her waist. This was how they always slept, wrapped together, even after all these years. "You think Samuel will make a good father?" Eleanor asked sleepily. "He seems so young, even though he is older than we were when we married." "He will be fine," Gideon assured her. "We raised him well. He is kind and responsible and loves his wife. That is all any child needs." "I hope he teaches his sons about grace," Eleanor murmured. "About second chances and redemption." "I am sure he will. You have made it a point to talk about such things with all our children, because it is important, because your story, our story, shows that no one is beyond hope." Gideon kissed the top of her head. "Go to sleep, my love. Everything is well." Eleanor drifted off feeling safe and content, as she always did in Gideon's arms, and Gideon lay awake for a while longer, marveling as he often did at the incredible journey his life had taken. From gunfighter to husband to father to grandfather, from despised to respected, from lost to found. It was more than he had ever dared to hope for, more than he had ever thought to deserve. The next morning dawned clear and cold. After breakfast, Gideon and Samuel rode out to check the herd while Eleanor and Rose worked on wedding plans. The land stretched out in all directions, thousands of acres of Montana grassland that the Hales now owned and managed. Gideon looked at it with satisfaction, knowing that every inch had been earned honestly through hard work and careful stewardship. "Father, can I ask you something?" Samuel said as they rode, of course. "Some of the older folks in town still talk about your past, about Texas and the gunfighting." Samuel glanced at his father. "I know you were a different man then, but I have never really understood what changed. What made you decide to become someone new?" Gideon was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I killed a boy in Abilene. He was only 16, and he drew on me because he wanted to be famous for gunning down Gideon Hale. I was faster, and I killed him without even thinking about it. When I stood over his body and realized how young he was, how his whole life was wasted because of pride and foolishness, I knew I could not do it anymore. I knew I had to change or I would lose my soul completely. So you came to Montana. So I came to Montana and got work at the Double R. I tried to keep my head down and just do my job, but I was still angry and lost, still carrying the weight of everything I had done. Then I met your mother and she changed everything." Samuel smiled. "How?" She heard me praying in the barn one night. I did not know she was there, but she heard me asking God to help me be better, to give me the strength to change. And instead of being afraid of me, instead of judging me for my past, she chose to see the man I was trying to become. She believed in me when I did not believe in myself, and that belief gave me the strength to actually change." "That sounds like Mother," Samuel said fondly. "She has always seen the best in people." "She has the gift of grace," Gideon agreed. "And she used that gift to save a man who was drowning in guilt and self-hatred. I owe her everything, Samuel." Everything good in my life comes from her decision to give me a chance." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, checking the cattle and looking for signs of illness or injury. The herd was healthy and well-fed, a testament to the care that the ranch hands provided under Gideon's direction. "I want you to know that I am proud to be your son," Samuel said suddenly. "I know that your past is complicated, but the man you are now is someone worth admiring. You have taught me about honor and hard work and treating people with respect. You have shown me that mistakes do not have to define a person, that change is possible if you are willing to do the work. Those are lessons I will pass on to my own sons." Gideon felt his throat tighten with emotion. "That means more to me than you know, son. My greatest fear when you were born was that I would fail you, that my past would somehow taint your future. Knowing that you are proud of me, that is a gift beyond measure." They finished their work and rode back to the house, where Eleanor had lunch waiting. The family gathered around the table, the conversation flowing easily as they discussed ranch business and wedding plans and Henry's studies. Gideon sat at the head of the table and felt the same overwhelming gratitude that filled him every time he looked at his family. After lunch, Rose pulled her father aside. "Papa, I need your advice about something." They walked out to the barn and Rose leaned against the fence, her expression troubled. "Michael's father does not approve of our engagement. He says that Michael should marry someone from a more established family, someone whose father does not have a questionable past." Gideon felt a familiar stab of pain. Even after all these years, his past could still cause problems for the people he loved. "I am sorry, Rose. I never wanted my history to hurt you." "It does not hurt me," Rose said firmly. "I am proud of who you are, Papa, but it hurts Michael. His father is threatening to disinherit him if he marries me." "What does Michael say?" "He says he does not care about the inheritance, that he would rather have me than his father's money, but I do not want to be the cause of a family rift." Gideon put his arm around his daughter. "Rose, I learned a long time ago that you cannot control what other people think of you. You can only control who you are and how you live your life. If Michael loves you enough to choose you over his inheritance, then he is the right man for you. And if his father cannot see beyond my past to recognize what a wonderful woman you are, then that is his loss, not yours." "But what if he is right?" Rose asked, her voice small. "What if I am not good enough because of where I come from?" "You listen to me," Gideon said, turning her to face him. "You come from love. You come from two people who fought like hell to build a good life and raise good children. You come from honesty and hard work and grace. That makes you better than any fancy family in Montana, and do not you ever forget it." Rose hugged him tightly. "I love you, Papa." "I love you too, sweetheart. Now let me talk to Michael, man to man." That evening, Gideon rode over to the neighboring ranch where Michael lived with his family. Michael's father, a pompous man named Cornelius Bradford, met him at the door with a sneer. "I suppose my son told you about our conversation," Bradford said coldly. "He did not, actually. My daughter did. And I am here to tell you that if you are judging Rose based on my past, you are making a terrible mistake. Your past is hardly the issue, Hale. The issue is that my son deserves better than a cattleman's daughter." Gideon felt anger rise in his chest, but he forced it down. Getting into a fight would only prove Bradford's point about his violent nature. Instead, he said calmly, "Your son deserves to marry a woman who loves him, who will be a good partner, who has been raised with strong values. Rose is all of those things. She is kind and smart and hardworking, and she will make Michael very happy. If you cannot see that because you are too busy looking down your nose at her family, then you are a fool." "How dare you?" Bradford sputtered. "I dare because I love my daughter, and I will not stand by and let you insult her." Gideon's voice was steel. "You can disinherit Michael if you want. That is your choice. But know that if you do, you will be cutting yourself off from a son who is better than you deserve and from a daughter-in-law who would have treated you with nothing but respect. Your loss will be our gain, and we will welcome Michael into our family with open arms." He turned and walked away, leaving Bradford standing speechless on the porch. When he got home, he found Michael waiting for him, looking nervous. "Sir, I want you to know that I am going to marry Rose no matter what my father says." Gideon studied the young man. Michael was 24, tall and earnest, with an honest face and work-roughened hands. He was not fancy or educated, but he clearly loved Rose. "Do you understand what you are giving up?" Gideon asked. "I am giving up money and land that come with conditions," Michael said firmly. "But I am gaining Rose, and that is worth more than any inheritance." Gideon smiled and extended his hand. "Then welcome to the family, son. We do not have as much money as the Bradfords, but we have something more important. We have love and loyalty and grace. And those things will carry you through when money fails." Michael shook his hand, relief evident on his face. "Thank you, sir. I promise I will take care of Rose. I know you will." The wedding took place on a beautiful May afternoon, with wildflowers blooming across the meadow and the mountains standing proud in the distance. Cornelius Bradford did not attend, but everyone else in the territory did, packing the small church in Benton Creek to witness the union of Rose Hale and Michael Bradford. Eleanor cried happy tears as Gideon walked their daughter down the aisle, and Gideon had to blink hard to keep his own emotions in check. Rose looked radiant in a white dress that Eleanor had spent months sewing, and Michael looked like he could not believe his luck. After the ceremony, the reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and food enough to feed the entire county. There was dancing and laughter and toasts to the happy couple. As the sun set, Gideon and Eleanor stood together and watched their daughter dance with her new husband. "Another chapter," Eleanor said softly. "Another blessing," Gideon replied. They had many more years together, years filled with the joys of grandchildren and the satisfaction of a ranch well run. Henry finished his veterinary training and returned to Montana, setting up a practice in Benton Creek, but living at the ranch and caring for their animals. Samuel took over more of the daily management of the ranch as Gideon grew older, proving himself a worthy successor. Rose and Michael built a small home on the edge of the Hale property, and Rose gave birth to a daughter they named Eleanor. Gideon's reputation as a gunfighter faded into legend, replaced by his reputation as a fair and honest rancher. The younger generation knew him only as the kind older man, who always had peppermints in his pockets for children and wise advice for young cowboys trying to find their way. One summer evening, when Gideon was 62 and Eleanor was 56, they walked together to the barn where their story had truly begun. They had done this often over the years, returning to the place where Eleanor had heard Gideon praying and made the choice to see beyond his rough exterior to his gentle heart. "Do you remember what you prayed for that night?" Eleanor asked as they stood in the barn, now old and weathered but still standing. "I prayed for help to be better," Gideon said. "I prayed for God to make my hands build instead of destroy. I prayed to be worthy of a different life. And your prayers were answered, more than answered. I asked for the strength to change, and God gave me you. I asked to be worthy of a different life, and God gave me a family and a home and a purpose. I asked for redemption, and God gave me 38 years of love and grace and second chances." Eleanor took his hand, the same hand that had once dealt death but had learned to give life. "Your hands built a ranch, Gideon Hale. They built a family. They built a legacy of goodness that will outlast both of us. Your hands became exactly what you prayed for them to be." Gideon pulled her into his arms, holding her close in the shadows of the barn where everything had changed. "I love you, Eleanor. You are the answer to every prayer I ever prayed. And you are mine," Eleanor replied, resting her head against his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart. They stood together until the stars came out, two people who had found each other in the midst of brokenness and had built something beautiful together. The gunfighter and the housekeeper, the killer and the believer, the lost and the found. They had proven that redemption was real, that love could transform, that gentle hearts could grow even in the roughest soil. As they walked back to the house, hand in hand under the vast Montana sky, Eleanor thought about all the prayers that had been answered, all the grace that had been given, all the love that had flourished in the years since that September evening when she had heard a cowboy praying alone in the barn. She had known in that moment that his heart was gentler than his hands, and she had been right. Gideon's hands had learned gentleness through her love, and his heart had learned peace through God's grace. Together, they had created a life worth living, a love worth fighting for, a legacy worth leaving. Years later, when their children and grandchildren gathered to celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary, Gideon stood before them all and told the story one more time. He told them about being lost and broken, about hearing God's call to change, about a woman who had believed in him when he did not believe in himself. "Your grandmother saw something in me that I could not see," he said, his voice still strong despite his age. "She heard me praying in a barn and chose to believe that I could be better than my past. And because she believed, I became better. That is the power of love, children. That is the power of grace. Never forget it." Eleanor stood beside him, her hair white now but her eyes still bright, and she added, "And never forget that everyone deserves a second chance. Everyone has the capacity to change if they are willing to do the work. Your grandfather was not defined by his worst moments, but by his decision to become better. That is true for all of us." The grandchildren and great-grandchildren listened with rapt attention, absorbing the lesson that had shaped their family. Later, after the celebration had ended and the house was quiet, Gideon and Eleanor retired to their room. "Do you think they understood?" Gideon asked as they prepared for bed. "I think they understood that love is stronger than fear, that grace is more powerful than judgment, that redemption is always possible," Eleanor replied. "And I think they understood that our story is their story too. We are all broken in some way, and we all need someone to believe in us." They settled into bed, wrapped in each other's arms as they had been for 50 years. Outside, the Montana wind whispered through the prairie grass, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the moon. The ranch was quiet and peaceful, a testament to everything they had built together. "I would do it all again," Gideon whispered into the darkness. "Every hardship, every struggle, every moment of doubt, I would do it all again for the privilege of spending my life with you." "And I would still choose to love you," Eleanor whispered back. "Even knowing how hard the road would be, I would still hear you praying in that barn and still believe in your gentle heart." They drifted off to sleep together, secure in the love that had sustained them through decades of life. And if God was listening, he heard 2 more prayers of gratitude rising from the little ranch in Montana, from 2 people who had found redemption in each other's arms and had spent their lives paying that grace forward. Gideon Hale lived to be 73 years old, passing peacefully in his sleep with Eleanor by his side. He was mourned by 3 children, 14 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren, as well as countless friends and neighbors whose lives he had touched. His funeral was attended by people from all over Montana, all of whom had stories about his kindness, his wisdom, his gentle strength. Eleanor lived another 5 years after Gideon's death, spending her time with her family and continuing the charitable work that had defined her life. She never remarried, saying that she had found her one true love and nothing could replace him. When she passed away at 78, she was buried beside Gideon on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a headstone that read, "Together in life, together in death, together in grace." The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through Samuel's line, and it prospered for generations. The story of Gideon and Eleanor became a cherished family legend, told and retold to each new generation. And the old barn where Eleanor had heard Gideon praying was preserved as a reminder of where it all began, of the moment when love and grace had transformed 2 broken lives into something beautiful. Years turned into decades, and decades turned into a century, but the lessons that Gideon and Eleanor had taught never faded. Their descendants carried forward the values of hard work and honesty, of grace and second chances, of gentle hearts and strong hands that built instead of destroyed. The Hale Ranch became a symbol in Montana of what could be achieved through redemption and love, a living testament to two people who had dared to believe that change was possible. And somewhere in heaven, Gideon and Eleanor walked hand in hand through fields of endless grass under skies of perfect blue, finally at peace, finally home, finally free from all the pain and struggle of their earthly lives. They had fought the good fight, they had finished the race, and they had kept the faith. And their reward was eternal love, eternal grace, eternal joy. Their story was complete, but its impact would ripple forward through time, touching lives and changing hearts, proving again and again that redemption is real, that love can heal, and that gentle hearts can flourish even in the harshest circumstances. From a desperate prayer in a barn to a legacy that spanned generations, Gideon and Eleanor had shown the world what was possible when two broken people chose to believe in each other and in the transforming power of grace. And that, truly, was a love story for the ages.